provocateur.media.
I think the main culture that we want to identify with, and you know, you call me a hippie for saying this, but is as humans. We're human beings, and we're living creatures, and we're sentient, and there's people in pain, and it's important that we look realistically at how it is we can really help those people out. And I think it's not just good for those people who are on the receiving end, but also for the givers and for us personally to see ourselves as more connected to this world and more connected to the people that are in it. And I think it betters us as well.
The Goldwaters is brought to you by Goldwaters Dubé, shaping the history of Canadian family law since 1981.
The Goldwaters vous est présenté par Goldwaters Dubé, modeler l'histoire du droit familial canadien depuis 1981.
Welcome to episode number 8 of The Goldwaters. I'm your moderator, Dan Delmar, and it's my pleasure to introduce The Goldwaters once again to you, Maître Anne-France Goldwater, senior partner at Goldwaters Dubé. We have Dr. Samantha Goldwater Adler, clinical psychologist, and Maître Daniel Goldwater, attorney at Goldwaters Dubé, here to comment on current events issues, drawing from their professional experience, and of course that trademark Goldwater wit. And guys, that we have our first guest of honor on the podcast. This is very special. And of course, it's the Dubé in Goldwaters Dubé, Marie-Hélène Dubé, 25 years experience in law, and Anne-France's longtime legal partner. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. I feel welcome by the family after 30 years knowing you. I think I'm now officially part of the Goldwaters.
Welcome, Marie-Hélène. Not that we don't see each other 7 days a week as it is.
So only now, though? I'm surprised.
Actually, I said 30, but it's not 30. It's more than that.
Yeah, it's more than 30 years, sure.
Yeah, it's 34.
Your mother raised me when I was an infant. I mean, she's kind of, in a way, my real mother.
Well, I think that we are a multicultural family.
That's for sure.
On brand.
And thank you for the intro. That's our topic today is multiculturalism. So the concept and, of course, the policies. Should multiculturalism be a way to continue to develop Canada, or should we take a look at some of the policies and rework them? So we're going to talk about all of that on the episode today. Of course, the refugee crisis and lots more. But first, let's just start with a simple question. Do you consider yourself a multiculturalist or a supporter of Canadian multiculturalism? Let's start with our guest of honor.
Well, I want to stay away necessarily from the politics associated in Quebec with the word multiculturalist. For sure, for me, as a child of an immigrant mother, diversity is part of my DNA. I want Canada to continue to be a pluralistic society. For me, that's key to my identity as a Quebecer and as a Canadian.
Interestingly, Marie-Hélène, you admitted the fact that on the your other parent is a Quebecer de souche, meaning a Quebecer with deep roots in this province, from a very intellectual family full of authors and editors and notaries and all those fine French-Canadian folk. You referenced the bigger part of your identity, the way I heard it, with your immigrant mom.
Well, no, I feel very much connected to the other roots, but I think the other roots is evident from my name. So therefore, I felt that for people who hear me, it's important to know what my background is coming into that conversation. But, it was a little bit more difficult growing up in Montreal as a biracial child, and I saw Montreal evolving into a more accepting and more diverse city, and I was very pleased that my children didn't live the same negative experiences that I lived when I was a child. And for me, it's very important to keep it that way for the future generations.
I agree with Marie-Hélène. I'm more interested and invested in the notion of pluralism, a pluralistic and diverse society. And I'm not really sure, and I hope we're going to explore this in today's podcast. I'm not sure how we got there. I don't know if it's the official policy of multiculturalism that did it, or something special about Canadian blood, if I can use an ethnic term.
Tastes like maple syrup.
Maybe that's it. It's our maple syrup, la tire, right? Our hot maple syrup poured on snow might explain why we're nicer to each other and sweeter.
I think on the most part, Canadian multiculturalism is a success. It's a source of national pride. It's something that Canadians, by far see as something unifying. It's interesting that the concept of multiculturalism, which by definition is saying, okay, the cultural mosaic, the salad of peoples, they are having a bunch of different peoples that can be together and still maintain their unique identity. And yet somehow, by espousing these views, by buying into these views and saying, yes, we should allow people from different cultures maintain their unique identity and we can still be together and exist peacefully, that the differences and accommodation of differences becomes a source of national pride. And it becomes a unifying force. And I think, to harken back to our discussion on the monarchy, national symbols and unifying forces are important. And I do think that Canada gives, we definitely have, it's not to say that everything is perfect and harmonious and wonderful in Canada. We have our own issues, of course. And it doesn't mean that that the various different groups and cultures all commingle perfectly and peacefully, and there isn't discrimination that happens. But I think on the most part, in broad strokes, I think it is a success. And like many Canadians, I do see it as a source of pride and identification with Canada.
I generally agree, and I do find it has been a positive policy. But when I take my Quebecer lens and I put it on, I have to say, I do see some cynicism behind the late Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who came up with this idea. In the intention, as far as I understand, I'm not a mind reader, was to dilute the Quebec question. Mm-hmm. And I think, moreover, I don't know how successful it's been for helping our Aboriginal communities. I mean, it's always lost in the discourse, It's like we get caught 100%. Up in this bicultural and bilingual identity, which he rejected. There was something called the Massey Commission that came up with this idea, and he rejected it explicitly, traumatized by the FLQ crisis, and said, "Oh no, we have to quell the Quebec fire," or I don't know, the mixed metaphor there, but. So I do sometimes, I have a strange sort of identity as a Quebecer, but I do sometimes feel that, a grievance about the policy.
But I think that when we look at the source of multiculturalism in Canada, we should not forget that the First Nations, before even French or English nations came along, the First Nations were diverse. So that diversity goes back even before colonization.
Oh, but you're getting too postmodern, perhaps, because you can talk about diversity within any group, Marie-Hélène, not to jump in.
No, because I think that it's important for us to recognize that it's been at every stage of the country. It's been part of the country. So it started with the First Nations. It continued at the time of Confederation with the French and the English. At the stage that we are at, we need to bring it to even to another level. I agree with you that it's a mistake to bring it back always to only the French and the English, as if Canada started with colonization.
Montreal, in particular, does have a wonderful. I want to say tolerance, but tolerance isn't even the word. It's just a laissez-faire attitude, just a who cares, whatever, you look different, you have this skin color, you have the other skin color, I couldn't care less, whatever. And there's a nice sort of co-mixing there that in my experiences traveling to other places, even throughout Canada, that I haven't necessarily seen the same thing. However, I think one thing that's really important to note is that it doesn't mean that Quebecers have embraced multiculturalism and that they necessarily think that, okay, well, just because they may be a bit more laissez-faire about people with different skin colors or religions, that they just think, okay, multiculturalism is great and everyone is fantastic. There is still a certain insularity and a certain latent xenophobia, sometimes not so latent xenophobia, and it's based much more around the French secular identity rather than the physical appearance. And so it ends up being that it doesn't matter so much what skin color you have or what religion necessarily you come from. It just matters that, well, you can look however you want as long as you still dress like us, you're secular like us, and you speak French like us. And then you're okay.
And we want to have your food.
Yes, and your
Bring
food.
along your food, please.
Which is delicious.
But while you talk about this laissez-faire, I just want to tag this conversation with a hashtag, not to be obnoxious, but there's a word for what this is. It's called interculturalism. That is the official policy in Quebec.
It is.
Okay, we don't have to speculate like here. There's a word for it. It's in reaction, I would say, to multiculturalism.
But interculturalism is not... the only difference is it's built around the idea that what brings people together is French. But it still recognizes that people coming from different cultural backgrounds can identify to different values or cultural identities.
Let's get into some of the specifics on multiculturalism. Canada is now presiding over the resettlement of tens of thousands of Syrian refugees. At the same time, we're seeing more people slip over the border in response to perhaps some aggressive enforcement of illegal immigration in the States. Do you have any concerns about the number of refugees that are coming into this country?
My major concern is that there aren't enough.
Here, here.
Yes.
Well, that's a short discussion. There we are. I want us to be clear. No. Before the cynical guy chimes in, 1 second. I want us to be 100% clear. These Syrian refugees, we have obligations by reason of international law to take in refugees from whatever corner of the world they come. You cannot leave people to die, civilians who are being targeted in this war. And I don't care what their political beliefs are. I don't care what their religious beliefs are. I care not one whit. There is no legitimate debate that could be had in this regard. The fact that we have to take a step to identify who's coming into our country, needless to say, you want to be sure this person X is a refugee, is entirely legitimate. But our absolute legal and moral duty to take in refugees is unquestionable. And that people could question that is such a loss of basic humanity that I live in terror that we're losing the sense of the most important moral values that we can have as a species on the earth. I'd like to think some issues are so resolved that I can go back to worrying about animal rights, but I'm going, oh my God, what happened to the Judeo-Christian values that say we must take in refugees, as many as we can possibly afford to take in. We must provide them health care. We must provide them assistance to learn our language or languages, and we must help them settle here. And I have no doubt that the overwhelming majority of the refugees that we are going to take into this country are going to be the proudest and most grateful Canadians of all, and will be productive and awesome members of our society. And that's the way it is. And that's the end of that discussion. And I will tolerate no dissent. I'm so upset.
I don't think the question was about the duty or the obligation. It was about our capacity. Those are different things. It's the execution of the obligation is what was being asked about. We have 45,000 refugees right now that are backlogged, okay? Some have been on there for years, okay? Are there concerns about our capacity to do this? It's not my opinion. Our government says that that they've already laid it out. They've said that there's a huge limit now on sponsorship groups for refugees, right? It's shot way down to like 1,000, I believe, is the number now for the whole year of 2017 that you can actually, small sponsorship groups can sponsor families coming into our country. And I find that there's this weird, almost, pissing contest about the number that we can take in. It's more about the quality of the integration. I mean, how many,
That's true.
Please don't misunderstand me. Again, I agree with you, Mom, wholeheartedly. Okay, about, you could call it Judeo-Christian, whatever you want to call it, but I don't see it that way. I just see it as being a good person, is taking people in who are in need. And if you have the resources, go about it and do it to the best of your ability.
I think that for Canadians, we're pretty divided in terms of how we view the influx of refugees coming in, particularly more recently as we're having refugees that are coming from the United States and crossing the border and crossing through the freezing cold Canadian winter nights to come into the provinces seeking refuge. And I think that, there's some Canadians that are looking at this and saying, this is our duty to help, and these are people in need, and let's open our homes. And other people are saying, who on earth are these other people that are coming into our country that we don't know who they are and are really quite afraid? And I think that it's really important to, I think this harkens back to when we were speaking about empathy and compassion before, to really be able to put ourselves in somebody else's shoes and to really be more informed and to be more action-oriented. So when we think of the refugees that are coming into Canada, or Syrian refugees, then we need to really try to put ourselves in their shoes and look at what is their context, where are they coming from, and just how they're completely in need. It's a matter of survival. People do not cross the border in Canadian winters at night with their families for fun. This is not an enjoyable activity. And if people are doing this, it's because they're afraid. They're afraid for their lives, for their livelihoods, and for the lives of their families. And I think it behooves us as Canadians, as Quebecers, and more so as human beings, to be able to, I'm going to take a step beyond multiculturalism and say, because I think that culture is a fluid construct that personally I have a difficult time kind of grappling with. I recognize there's differences between different people in terms of their backgrounds, but I think that the differences within cultures, however those are defined, are far larger than the differences between cultures, however it is those are defined. And I think the main culture that we want to identify with, and you call me a hippie for saying this, but is as humans. We're human beings, and we're living creatures, and we're sentient, and there's people in pain, and it's important that we look realistically at how it is we can really help those people out. And I think it's not just good for those people who are on the receiving end, but also for the givers and for us personally to see ourselves as more connected to this world and more connected to the people that are in it. And I think it betters us as well.
I want to point out, by the way, that it's economists who have done the studies and pointed out in the study of the science of happiness that, in fact, giving gestures of altruism, and it's the capitalist who's saying it, the fact of giving and being altruistic is a major component of happiness in life. And I therefore agree wholeheartedly with what Samantha says, that you enrich the host society when you take in people in need and help them and permit them to thrive and bring them into your family. And I think for me that brings me to my concern, in fact, about multiculturalism, because I also agree with Samantha. My God, we are so politically different. It's a wonder that we even both have arms and legs. We are so different. And yet on this, we resonate exactly on the same wavelength. I think that culture is fluid, a very fluid construct. And I think that if you really, really receive the immigrant, the refugee, the other, into your family, the family of your community, society, province, and nation, then part of it is sharing and imparting to the new person your culture, that national culture that he can embrace and be part of. And I think that maybe a certain failing of multiculti is in the noble desire to want to express tolerance, fails also to communicate enough about the awesome parts of our own culture, because Canadians are very modest about having a culture. And maybe that's also our strength. We're very modest about our culture, and maybe we don't do enough to share those values, communicate those values, and that's what creates a certain insecurity amongst many Canadians born here, where they feel overwhelmed by the arrival of people with whom they don't feel they can relate. And I think if we want our project as a receiving country to receive a lot of immigrants and refugees to succeed, we have to get that minority of Canadians who are fearful of immigration, we have to get them on side with this national project.
I'm always open to dialogue and to I was going to say rational dialogue, but it doesn't even have to be rational dialogue, just considerate and respectful dialogue between people and trying to find the middle ground or some sort of common ground. We all have a fear of the unknown and whatever is unfamiliar to us. And it's no accident that people in urban centers where there's a lot more diversity, tend to have less qualms or less difficulties with concepts of, with refugees coming in or with immigrants coming in, because it's more familiar. They become part of your culture. Whereas when you get people in rural communities where there's just less exposure to diversity, that are a little bit more afraid. And I think it's completely natural. And I'm not saying that people from rural communities are less than people from urban communities. Not at all. It's a very human thing.
Overcoming fear and hostility towards others and inherent xenophobia and implicit prejudice, these are things that I think make people good and make us good as Canadians when we achieve those things. I'm just cautioning against a sort of an impulsive altruism. I just want to never lose sight of resources that are available, how to administer them intelligently.
Yes, I agree with you, but I think that if we look at how the first wave of refugees that came from Vietnam and in Cambodia, there hasn't been as much difficulties as the difficulties that you're describing with the Somalian communities. So I wonder if the struggles are not, if the cause is not so much because they're refugees, but maybe because the policies a few decades later were not designed to help them integrate. Also, the Somalian communities are probably going to be more affected by systemic racism than refugees coming from Eastern Europe, for example. In my own community, in the Asian community, there was also a huge number of refugees that came from Haiti in the beginning of the 70s, flying the Duvalier regime. And we can see up until now that there are real struggles just here in Montreal, in Montréal Nord. There are still situations that are terrible and that politicians are not tackling. It's one of the poorest districts in all of Canada, and it's not receiving the attention that it should receive. So yes, you're right, but that we need the policies to redress all the problems that makes it more difficult for certain communities to succeed than for others.
That's very well worded, and I can't really find fault in it. Just make a reference, I guess, to our last episode on empathy. I guess the only sort of argument I'm trying to make is just one for more rational compassion rather than a sort of like I said, an impulsive sort of empathy. It's just when you take people on, think of the long term and think of doing right by anyone you're taking in with a big heart in the long term.
That being said, I want to note Montreal was just named the world's best city for students. Mm-hmm. And the students who were polled were international students. Now, we've always been very high ranking, but we've moved up now to first place, knocking Paris off its perch, where it's been for the last 5 years. And
Take that, Paris.
Take that, Paris.
Take that, other French place. You're now second best French place.
Exactly. Apropos. So if the perception of students from the four corners of the earth is that we're that kind of a welcoming community, well, that says again that there is something in Canadian and Quebecois attitudes and civic engagement too, I dare say, that makes us welcoming. It's more than just tolerating the other, but warmly welcoming. So I think it pays, and I think we should engage in studies to try to understand better what it is in our cultural attitudes that makes us so accepting of immigrants, and that use that to build an educational foundation for other Canadians to reach out in a more communicative way to other Canadians, to make other Canadians understand how our communities are enriched as we receive more people.
So given that young people do view Montreal as really a great destination, would you say that Canadian multiculturalism is better in terms of the way it's played out in this country than elsewhere in the world? How do we stack up against other multicultural societies?
Actually, Irene Bloomrad is a Canadian sociologist, though she's a prof at Berkeley. I'm familiar with her mostly because I had gone to a conference at McGill on Canadian exceptionalism recently. And so I was awash in data, but no. Apparently, the stats are in, and we do have the highest naturalization of immigrants in all OECD countries. Now, what does that mean? It means that they become citizens faster. They have higher civic engagement than most any other OECD country, and these are all really lovely things. My only thought in all this is, to what extent is this really a reflection of policy rather than facts on the ground here? We have a very highly urbanized population, more urbanized than the United States, where there are larger rural communities which are farther away from diverse communities and have their own politics about it. And moreover, we also there's no minority here that has more than 15% share of the Canadian population. So that's another intelligent strategic sort of fact, that there's no minority to sort of dominate the discourse, positive or negative.
Now, that's an important policy choice. Now, that's something legitimate that a government could draw its attention to and say that the way to promote diversity and to ensure the success of a chosen policy of multiculturalism is to make sure no one particular culture can put itself in the position to dominate another.
Totally agree.
Yeah, that's certainly huge. We're not the only
Yes.
country that has succeeded with multiculturalism. Australia as well is tremendous at attracting immigration, international students, bringing talent in. However, they're tougher nuts than Canadians. They're tougher nuts to crack, and I think there remain more a tendency, I don't want to call it a discrimination, a certain distrust of the other outside the major urban centers than here in Canada. I don't know what it is that makes us such a modest and unprepossessing culture. I don't know what it is. We have such an aggressive neighbor to the south of us. It's unusual. Maybe that's how we've preserved our voice, by making ourselves heard without shouting as much. But I think part of it, too, an important ingredient, is the modesty of that patriotism and that nationalism, and that the pillars of our national identity, which also include, to my mind, CBC and Statistics Canada, hockey, needless to say, and as Samantha correctly pointed out, our policy of multiculturalism that's been around since our second Constitution Act.
And isn't it a lovely thing that multiculturalism could be part of our culture? I just think it's a beautiful thing. It's a very sweet way of seeing things and a perspective. And if you're talking about why Canada may be a more where immigrants and refugees adapt better here and tend to succeed more here in Canada, I think that's part of it, is that if the culture that you're being integrated in sees you already as part of the culture, then it makes everything more fluid in terms of the adaptation.
But
Absolutely. But we have to also be realistic. What has happened in the last few weeks in Canada makes me worry. More Canadians have to fight to keep this, because I feel that it's endangered. There's been the killings at the mosque in Quebec City last month, 4 weeks ago, and a few days ago there's been the motion that was presented by a Liberal MP that created a lot of backlash against her. She received about 50,000 threats because people were angry that Parliament may adopt a motion condemning Islamophobia.
Can you imagine? Just the motion.
I think, yes, we can all be happy about what we have, but we have to
We can't
fight
be
to
complacent.
keep it. Yes.
And in fact, in recent statistics, in 2015, 2015 polling shows that opposition to immigration has nearly doubled since 2005. Yes. So you're absolutely right. We can definitely pat ourselves on the back, and it sounds really nice and makes us feel all warm and fuzzy. But we can't be complacent. And in all this discussion, there still leaves out, our indigenous communities. We're talking about immigration, we're talking about refugees, and frankly, the most harmful immigrants that we've had in North America have been, white settlers coming in, and they're the ones who have really decimated the local communities and continue to do so, frankly.
For the sake of antithesis, just to put it out there too, we also should be concerned, again, about the way that we integrate immigrant populations in terms of assimilating. I know this word's become like a scare word, whatever, rebrand the word, call it integration or welcoming or a hug. I don't know what to call it. But a lot of immigrants that come to our country also do have very conservative values in certain domains that might really flip out the left. I mean, I recall in Toronto, there was, it was put forward by immigrant communities. They were very much against the new curriculum in elementary and high schools that normalized homosexuality.
But hold on, assimilation or multiculturalism or interculturalism, anyways, coming to this country doesn't mean that you have to adopt leftist politics. Please, Lord, God forbid. No. But that being said, in the middle of that observation, Daniel, with which I agree, is another fear that I have, which is unless we pursue policies of assimilation, we are letting in people who come from other cultures, and I want to be provocative about this, from other cultures that are poorer philosophically and that don't share our charter values, like the equality of women, and we face that in many cultures, or the notion that there's freedom of press, freedom of speech, that there's equality for lesbians, gays, and transgendered peoples and two-spirited peoples and so on. And these are uniquely North American values, and if we receive people, they don't necessarily share our vision also, for instance, of the secular state. And unless we find some way to inculcate our values with these people, and we live in a democracy and the numbers of these immigrant peoples are growing, we might find ourselves voted out of the values that we hold so dear.
No, and I agree with your point. Again, I'm not trying to say that you have to, that immigrants have to adopt left-wing values. I'm just saying that when we, the one who shall not be named, Donald Trump, I'm just saying he just appeared. It's like a
boogeyman.
It's like Candyman. That we should just be. I'm sometimes a little concerned that it could happen here, and there can be a hyper vulgar nationalism that can take root here, and we might be surprised from where it comes from.
Are you talking about the notion that there can be a leader like Trump that would be elected because of populism?
Yeah,
populism. That's what I'm talking about.
Are you saying
and
that
the populism,
that's for sure.
And this populism cannot necessarily come from white Christian majority people. Sometimes it can come from people. Look, there are many immigrant communities, and again, I define myself. I'm the child of a refugee. In fact, my father, and I don't see this as. Immigrants can be as racist as anybody else or as xenophobic, and they can see themselves as the last good immigrant as well.
Definitively, there's all kinds of discriminations.
It can pervert our politics, is my point.
No, I don't think that you have to look at immigration as something that can pervert
It's not the immigration itself; it's the assimilation that should be that goes along with it. I'm trying to say
they don't need to assimilate. People just need to accept that when they come to Canada, there's a constitution first of all, and the Charter of Rights is part of the constitution. And most people understand that. That's not assimilation.
No.
That's just accepting les règles du jeu. You're accepting that when you're coming here, there's a Charter of Rights. And that's number one. Number two, there's other laws. The same way, there's certain countries where there's no, traffic is not regulated by traffic lights. When people come here, they accept that it's different. We have traffic lights and they adapt. But it's not assimilation.
But that doesn't touch their religious observance and their cultural prerogatives. That's the problem.
I don't think it needs to.
It doesn't need
when
to.
it's
There's
the Charter
certain
of
things.
Rights, it does.
But yeah,
Well,
but to
no.
Mark's point, the Charter, I mean, I naive here to say that laws do, by their nature, assimilate people and their attitudes, and that they're a reflection of core principles in the law,
But
whether it's regulatory or a charter.
There are things that are very simple. For example, honors killings are regulated by the criminal code. It's the same criminal code for everybody. It's not possible.
But we don't need special rules for honor killings.
We don't.
But hold on a minute.
But nobody's saying that they can ever be legitimate because there's a criminal code, there's a charter. So I think these are exactly the fears that create the xenophobia, all the negative sentiments that we were all condemning 5 minutes ago. We already have the tools to make sure that new Canadians abide by our rules.
Just a minute. There are countries, let's keep in mind honor killings have nothing to do with religious observance.
Yes, I didn't
But
say
they're
that.
cultural values. And in those countries where honor killings are practiced, they also have criminal laws and they also prohibit murder. Whatever their legislative text is, I don't care. There's no such thing. There are lawless areas that are not nations. But in actual organized nation states, you have laws that prohibit murder, just like the Canadian Criminal Code prohibits murder. The difference is that the cultural values that are prevalent in certain of these societies permit or tolerate, let us say, honor killings. They will just not prosecute a family, because it's often a conspiracy of several members of a family to kill a young woman who's affected the family's honor. We cover it under murder under a criminal code, not because they don't have a criminal code in the country of origin, but because our cultural values do not tolerate honor killings. So the more this conversation advances, the more I think we're moving toward assimilation. And speaking to your point, Marie-Hélène, about the MP who proposed the motion to condemn Islamophobia, you realize, had she been a white Christian asking for a motion to condemn Islamophobia, it would have passed in a minute. It's because she herself is a person of color who's Muslim. So the level of the aggression and the threats toward her are a double, triple, quadruple expression of discrimination and xenophobia on a scary level, because it's Canada.
It is.
And I believe she wanted that the day of the tragedy with the 6 Muslims who were brutally killed in Quebec City while worshiping, that's like the worst type of murder imaginable in my book. She wants the day of their death to be commemorated. And here's where I profoundly disagree. Profoundly. I think what should be commemorated is April 17th. Because on April 17th, 1982, we got our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And if we want to communicate something to native-born citizens or the people we receive day to day, or even to the world at large, is that what we celebrate is not the tragedy of a horrific death and to give that glory, but to the contrary, that we are a culture of life and liberty, and that what we celebrate is the Constitution and the elimination of hatred in the social fabric, because that's what the Constitution, to my mind, represents in many measures.
I share completely your sentiment with respect to the Charter of Rights. I think that the liberties and the freedoms that we have here are something I'm very proud of. And most Canadians also are very, very proud of them. I don't think that's a problem. I think that's a success. And that was the point I was trying to make earlier, that I think that despite the fact that it's true what Daniel is describing, that many immigrants may have conservative values, but that does not prevent them from adhering to the Charter values. And same for immigrants that have more values that are more left from the left. What's common is that people who will choose Canada because it's a country where there's freedoms, security of your person, and where there's equality. That's the common life project for most Canadians, and we should look at what brings us together and unite us in terms more than the differences. For sure, even from native Canadians, it took some time to values evolve. So maybe someone who comes, let's say, from the Philippines, where divorce is not accepted, it will take, it's not legal. You can't divorce in the Philippines. So it will take them a few years to understand what our laws of family laws are. But with a bit of patience, there is no real social disturbance that can. I think that we shouldn't make a bigger problem than it really is, and that we don't need to go towards assimilation, that just by building from what we have in common, we will get there.
Daniel made reference to this earlier, Canadian exceptionalism. Obviously, by several objective parameters, we're doing multiculturalism better than a lot of countries in the world. How can we have an influence on the United States and Europe and sort of project some of that Canadian tolerance and openness to parts of the world that could need it?
I think, frankly, that we're already starting to do that, and I think that whatever people have to say about Trudeau, I think that he is putting a good face and a good description of our values out to the world, and I think that the best way to lead is by example. I think the best way to get, the same way that I think on a more micro level, that the best way to have immigrants feel connected to the community and become part of the culture is by example. I think it's the same thing on a world stage, and being able to show that we can still have open policies, we can still have relatively open door policies and accept people and still succeed and still thrive, and be able to project that out into the world, I think is a very important example to set. And if people see that this is going by smoothly and peacefully and is still beneficial to our local population, then I think that is the best thing that we can do.
One thing that I learned at the conference, and this is kind of a narrow issue, so it's not going to be particularly sexy, but I do think it was important for me to find this out, and I feel like it's something people can do. That it comes to recognizing foreign credentials, that a lot of our professional orders, and this is a provincial jurisdiction, because a lot of these professional orders, it's a provincial matter, and professional orders have to make treaties with other nations, other states around the world. And for example, most or the plurality of immigrants that we're receiving in this country are from South Asia, and we have about 0 treaties with these people to recognize their educational credentials. Whereas with Australia, there's about 8. And Australians actually make up they're the bottom ranking in terms of immigrants that are coming to this country. There's an absurdity there. So anybody out there right now listening who's a member of a professional order, whatever it might be, look into this, please. See what you can do. This is the real way to get people jobs and to have them integrate and thrive in our country.
But you see, this is where this ugly tribalism and protectionism comes out. It's always easy to talk about grand principles until you come to something that threatens your job. So if you're in the professional order of, dog walkers, right? The last thing you want is competition from younger, more energetic and exotic dog walkers.
Unless they're Australian.
And all of a sudden, you want your professional order to make the criteria so strict as to make it impossible for foreign educated people to qualify. And we certainly see a lot of that in Quebec. Like, nobody gets qualified as anything. And I kind of scratch my head. Do they really think that every other university on the planet is garbage and nobody's going to qualify here at all? I certainly take your point. I didn't realize that we could have reciprocal treaties like that, Daniel. Wow, good clarification.
And this is one of the tragedies of all these cab drivers that we see in Montreal who are doctors and lawyers in their home country.
And engineers and architects.
Right, and they're raising a family. These are good citizens with great values who are raising a whole family on a taxi person's salary, and we could be doing more.
Well,
Yes.
that's certainly putting our money where our mouth is. I love how there's always a lot of dialogue in governments about infrastructure projects and how important they are. The real infrastructure of a country in the modern age is its people. And the more people you have, the more it generates economic activity, which raises tax revenues, which creates that virtuous cycle of productivity. And that's the most awesome infrastructure project at all. I wonder why we can't announce projects to settle points further north, outside that narrow strip of big cities that are in the southern part of Canada, and invite immigrants to come say, we'll give you a piece of land and come and build your own home.
Well, I agree with Daniel. I agree with you, Anna. But I think we have to go beyond the recognition of the foreign diplomas and look at what is happening to the second generation Canadians. The rate of unemployment is almost similar for the parents that comes and have to abandon their careers as doctors or engineers and their children. And that is, I think, a catastrophe for this country. These are children who are often born here and for whom it will be twice more difficult to find a job than for non-immigrant, well, actually, it's not just non-immigrants. There's an issue of, obviously, of systemic racism in there, because what I'm talking about is a situation that affects mostly Arab and Muslim communities and Black communities. So the statistics that I'm referring to for these two segments of the population are disastrous. It makes no sense. Second generation children that are born here, that have been raised in our schools, are not finding jobs because of their names or because of their skin colors. I mean, I can't believe it.
So you don't view it as a problem of immigration. You view it as a problem of systemic discrimination that would then apply to native-born people who immigrated 3 generations ago, that would apply then to native-born people of color and Arab and Muslim people, right? That's the issue. Okay, so that's still separate from immigration, but still a challenge in society at large.
Yes.
Hence the need to have even more integrated communities. That's the only way you can solve that problem. You need more diversity, not less, I think.
I think absolutely. And to follow up on your point, I think absolutely what we need is more diversity, not less. The best antidote to people being afraid of or discriminating against immigrant communities or against visible minorities is by actually knowing visible minorities and knowing immigrants. And the more the better, because the more you get to know people that you may otherwise perceive as different than you, the more they become familiar and the more they become part of you and part of your community. And that definitely, it sounds like a very utopian view and is not necessarily how things are always playing out. And even in Canada, where we espouse multiculturalism, as you're saying, Marie-Hélène, you're absolutely right. We still have major problems with discrimination. And there still are a lot of Canadians that are against, that think that we have too many visible minority immigrants. And people actually admit to this in survey polls, which is disturbing that people would even say this out loud. So I think that the best thing that we can do is more diversity, not less, more support to communities that are experiencing difficulties. And I think that that's the best thing that we can possibly do at this point.
And more assimilation.
I wouldn't go that far.
Borg-style assimilation.
We're all the Borg collective.
As soon as assimilation I was waiting for someone to mention the Borg. Good talk, everyone. Thank you. Thank you. And how did you enjoy your experience being the first guest of honor on the podcast?
It was a wonderful experience. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Matt Dubé, and thank you, Goldwaters.
And Marie-Hélène, I'd just like to thank you for being here. I am absolutely delighted, and I couldn't think of a better first guest speaker for us to have on the podcast, because really, you might as well be part of this podcast every time, because I think I share in Daniel's views and in Mom's view that you're always part of our family.
I think we share the same view, the 4 of us, and Lionel and Mommy Thérèse.
And I also think there's a good reason that you're the partner in the firm. I think you do bring some balance to the force. And it's always a pleasure.
Complementarity. That's
yes.
the
Interculturalism, maybe.
There we go.
Well, then, thank you to the four Goldwaters, and join us next time for another episode of The Goldwaters. You can listen to past episodes at thegoldwaters.ca and join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter using the hashtag #TheGoldwaters. You can subscribe on iTunes. It's on Lisbon and SoundCloud. Please subscribe and comment, and don't forget to join us next time. I'm Dan Delmar, your moderator, and thank you, Goldwaters Index.
Thank you, Dan.
Thanks, Dan.
Provocateur.media